There's something they never told you about cemeteries. Something that even gravediggers refuse to speak about. Do you really believe that when someone dies, they simply rest in peace? That everything ends with the final stone on the grave? If your answer is yes, then you are about to uncover the most terrifying and unexplainable truth about death that you never imagined. The night was calm, but the sense of unease was undeniable. Soft footsteps on the earth broke the silence, followed by a sigh, almost as if something was there, watching. I've worked in this for years, but what I experienced that night, alone in the cemetery, made me question everything, even my sanity. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't just a ghostly vision. It was more than that. Something that should have never happened. Something that the dead should never do. The mausoleum door creaked as it slowly shut, the sound of metal against metal reverberating deep into the soul. The silence that followed was even heavier. Did you know that gravediggers face more than just tombs and bones? They face the dead themselves. And what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you've ever heard about the supernatural. This is not just another ghost story. It's not about dark figures or eerie noises. What happened that night was so unexplainable that even I, after seeing it all, still ask myself, did I really see that, or was it a nightmare? The sound of approaching footsteps, almost imperceptible, heightened the tension, as if death itself was about to speak. Get ready, because what comes next cannot be explained. And if you dare to keep watching, your view on the dead and what they can do will never be the same. There is no going back after hearing the truth, not after knowing what happens when death is not the end. The footsteps were now so close that it felt as if something or someone was just about to appear. The suspense was unbearable. Now, the real question is, do you truly want to know what happens when the last flame goes out? Will you listen until the end? Because what is about to be revealed will shake you in ways you never imagined. Death has never felt so real. Chilling tales from gravediggers. What they never told you. The night grew darker. The wind whispered between the tombstones, as if carrying secrets that could never be spoken aloud. The gravedigger felt a presence, but he couldn't see it. The weight in the air was unbearable, as if the earth itself was waiting to swallow something far heavier than the bodies buried there. I thought I was alone, at least. I believed I was, he said, almost unable to believe the words leaving his own mouth. The first time I felt it, I thought it was just my imagination, maybe exhaustion getting the best of me. But soon, I realized it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Then, a soft tapping sound, like an invisible hand brushing against a tombstone, interrupted his thoughts. He turned around. No one was there. The fear tightened in his chest, but he tried to ignore it. I work with this every day. I've seen it all. The cemetery, the silence, it's just part of the job. But that night, the silence was different. Something was moving, something beyond human comprehension. He could feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting to be discovered. When I saw it for the first time, I thought I was looking at a spirit. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It stood there between the graves watching me. But it wasn't a ghost. It had no face, no shape, just a presence. Something dark. The wind picked up, rattling dry leaves across the ground, creating an eerie trail of sound that seemed to follow his steps. His breath quickened. His heart pounded. but the silence was even heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but the worst was yet to come. Every night, it came closer. I could feel it, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing, just the darkness. But I knew it was there. He paused, eyes distant, as if trying to push back memories too terrifying to recall. Then I started hearing the voices, the whispers, first from far away, but soon they were so close, so real. It was like the dead were trying to tell me something. But what they said, I don't know if I should have listened. The whispers grew louder, a rasping voice, barely audible, distorted by the wind, yet clear enough to send chills down the spine. Each word scratched at his soul, like a warning from the darkness itself. I tried to run, but I couldn't. Each night, the cemetery felt more alive, in a way that didn't make sense. The dead weren't resting. They were waiting for something, or someone. The tension in the air was suffocating. Something was coming closer, but the gravedigger didn't know what it was. The sound of approaching footsteps, growing faster, made the fear claw its way up his chest. And then, in a sudden flash of dread, he looked at the mausoleum in front of him. Something moved within the shadows, something that shouldn't be there. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Other gravediggers heard the same sounds, saw the same figures in the shadows. But no one wanted to talk about it, and those who did never came back to tell the story. That final sentence hung in the air, a silent death sentence unspoken. The cemetery itself seemed to be waiting for the last word to be spoken. What lay behind that presence, that shadow? What was waiting in the darkness? I don't know what it is. I know what I saw, what I heard, but I have no answers. The cemetery, death itself, it's not what you think. The dead don't rest. And what haunts me is the thought that maybe they don't want to. The sound of a stone rolling across the ground, followed by a long sigh, was the last thing heard before absolute silence. Something was there, something that would never be explained, something that might be waiting for you. The silence remained heavy, impenetrable. Every step the gravedigger took made the ground crack, as if the cemetery itself were alive, waiting for him. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, an invisible pressure, seeping from the gravestones, the buried tombs, the very air itself. He turned again, fear on his face, but there was no one, nothing but the thin mist that had begun to creep through the graves. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something was happening there, something not human. His breathing quickened. He could hear the wind stirring the trees around him, but he knew that wasn't the sound he was hearing. It was deeper, something rising from the earth, from the depths of the cemetery itself, as if something was waiting to be set free. That night, I wasn't alone. I was being followed, a heavy dragging sound, like an old door slowly opening, was the only answer. He looked around, but the mist blurred his vision. He couldn't see what was there, but he could feel it. A cold chill ran down his spine, and for a moment he was frozen in place. Then a dark shadow moved between the tombstones, and his heartbeat pounded in his ears. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. All I knew was that the shadow, that thing, was coming toward me. The footsteps grew closer, slow, deliberate. But no matter how hard the gravedigger tried to move, his legs refused to obey, as if the earth itself were holding him in place. The cemetery wouldn't let him go. I knew that if I turned around, I wouldn't just see a shadow. I would see something that should not be there. But in that moment, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I turned around. A deep sigh filled the air, like something emerging from the darkness itself. The shadow came closer, closer, until he finally saw it. A tall figure, shrouded in a black cloak, its form indistinct, but its eyes burned like lanterns. Cold, unforgiving, empty. I couldn't see its face. But its eyes, the eyes told me everything. They were hollow, as if death itself was part of its existence. They watched me, waiting. The tension thickened as the figure drew nearer. The gravedigger couldn't breathe. His own heartbeat thundered in his ears, blending with the howling wind, which had now turned fierce, menacing. I don't know how, but something made me run. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. But no matter how fast I went, that figure was always there, asterisk, behind me, watching. It wasn't chasing me. It didn't have to. It was simply observing. The air grew heavier. The world around him felt wrong, as if something much greater was about to emerge. And then I heard it. The laughter. It wasn't human. It was twisted, warped, like death itself was mocking me. And in that moment I knew what I was facing wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a lost soul. It was something far worse. Something that had long lost even the essence of death. He turned, eyes wide in horror. But there was nothing there. The cemetery had gone silent again, but the fear remained. He knew whatever had been there could never be explained, and he knew he would not be the last to hear that laughter echoing in the darkness. I try to tell people, but who believes a gravedigger talking about the dead laughing in the night, about shadowed figures lurking between the tombstones? No one believed me. Not until others started telling the same stories. Not until others started seeing what I saw. His final words carried a sense of quiet desperation, as if he knew that even now, something was still watching him, something that would follow him until the end of his days, something that, one day, might be waiting for someone else. But what about you? Do you believe in any of this? Or will you need to feel the presence of death creeping closer to understand what is truly real? The gravedigger, now with trembling hands, looked around once more, feeling the weight of the darkness. The wind, once a distant whisper, had become a deafening roar, as if the cemetery itself was trying to warn him of something much greater. He didn't know if the feeling of being followed was just in his head, or if there was something real, something he couldn't see, but that had always been there, always watching. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, but you couldn't see what it was? Something so close that even the air around you felt heavy. That's what I felt that night. And I know that even now I am not alone. No matter where I go, the feeling of being watched never disappears. He took a step forward, but the sensation of moving deeper into the cemetery, into the unknown, only grew stronger. His footsteps echoed strangely, almost as if the earth itself was swallowing every movement. But there was something else, something that made his instincts scream at him to run, yet he couldn't. Something held him there, as if the cemetery itself was draining his energy, wanting him to become part of it. Have you ever felt the need to run, but something held you in place, as if an invisible force was controlling you, stopping you from moving? That's what I started to feel, and I didn't know if it was fear or something much deeper. Then the shadow appeared again, so close, he could almost feel the cold radiating from it. But he didn't look directly. He didn't want to see any more. He already knew what it was, what was waiting for him. I will never forget that feeling, the feeling that death was right there, standing in front of me. What would you do if you saw something like that? Asterisk. Something so dark? Would you dare to look? Or, like me, would you try to escape as fast as you could? The laughter echoed again, but this time it was louder, clearer, as if the very earth was laughing with it. And in that moment, the gravedigger realized something even more disturbing. He was not alone in the cemetery anymore. Not only was a shadow following him, but something else was there too. Something he couldn't see, but he could feel it. A presence waiting for him to discover what lay buried in the depths of the graves. Who else is here with me? Is it just a cemetery, or is there something more? Has anyone else ever felt what I felt? Or is this happening only to me? He looked around, but the darkness swallowed everything. The laughter was no longer just laughter. Now, it was a call, an invitation, as if the dead were calling him to enter their world, to see what was beyond. But he knew, if he followed that voice, there would be no way back. And you, if you were in my place, would you follow that call? Or, like me, would you be trapped in an internal battle, trying to decide whether to cross that line? What do you think would happen if you accepted the invitation? The wind intensified. The trees shook violently, but the cemetery remained still, as if it were a living entity, watching everything with an indifferent gaze. The gravedigger took a step back, but something stopped him. For the first time, he felt it. He was standing on the threshold between the world of the living and the dead, and he knew, from that moment on, there was no turning back. Have you ever felt that, somehow, the line between life and death isn't as clear as we think? That maybe, just maybe, asterisk what exists between these two worlds is much closer to us than we imagine. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but he knew something was about to happen. He could feel it. The darkness was closing in around him, and he knew that if he didn't leave now, he never would. The last thing he heard was the laughter, now closer, now real. I wonder how many more will hear that laughter. Asterisk, how many more will fall victim to whatever lurks in the shadows? And more importantly, are you ready to discover what waits beneath the earth? The gravedigger, now with his mind completely overtaken by fear, looked around, trying to understand what was happening. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They moved as if they had a life of their own, crawling over the stones and tombs, forming impossible shapes. He tried to focus, tried to rationalize, but the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes paralyzed him. Have you ever felt like time stopped for a moment, as if everything around you started moving slower? Except you? I felt that night. The world around me seemed frozen, and I was the only thing moving. And while that happened, something was watching. The wind suddenly stopped. as if the earth itself had stopped breathing. The silence took over the cemetery, but it wasn't comforting silence. It was the kind of silence that suffocates you, that makes you feel like something is about to happen, something you can't predict. Have you ever felt that when the silence is too deep, it carries a presence? As if the air itself was dense, full of something unseen, but that makes itself felt in every fiber of your body. I didn't know whether I should run or just wait. He looked again at the tombstone in front of him. Something was there, something he couldn't identify. But now, it was impossible to ignore. It was as if the stone itself was breathing, slowly, as if it were alive, pulsing with an energy that shouldn't exist. Can you imagine standing in front of a cold stone, asterisk, and yet feeling like it's not so cold after all, as if, somehow, it was part of something much greater, something you can't understand? He stepped back, but at the same time, he felt like his body no longer obeyed him. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him back, dragging him into the darkness, into the heart of the cemetery. The sensation of being swallowed by that darkness was inescapable. Have you ever felt a force greater than your own will, pulling you toward a place you didn't want to go, as if your choices didn't matter against something much more powerful? What would you do if you knew that with every step you were getting closer to something or someone that could change everything? The gravedigger knew. He couldn't turn back anymore. The feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming. He felt the eyes on him, the pressure of those invisible presences growing, as if the cemetery itself was rising, ready to reveal its deepest secret. And then he heard it, the sound, a whisper, low and almost imperceptible, but clear enough to make his spine freeze. You know you heard it, don't you? It's not just in your mind. Something is trying to talk to you, calling you, and the scariest part, you know that if you don't answer, asterisk, something terrible will happen. The voice, now clearer, seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the cemetery itself was speaking inside his mind. He tried to close his ears, but he couldn't. The voice slipped in, seeping into his thoughts, making him lose control over his own sanity. Could you ignore that voice if it was calling you? Or, like me, would you step closer, curious to know what it really wanted to say? What do you think death wants from us? Why does it call to us like this? The gravedigger couldn't resist anymore. He moved forward, feeling himself being pulled, as if his mind was no longer his own. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and he heard something moving beneath the earth. But it wasn't just a vibration. It was as if something, or someone, was rising to the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Would you have the courage to take the next step? Or, like me, would you stand still, asterisk, waiting to see what is buried beneath the ground? As he stepped closer to the tombstone, a dark shadow appeared before him. It was a silhouette, tall and imposing, but it had no face, no defined form. It was pure darkness, and yet he knew it was aware of him. It had been watching him all along. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run. But at the same time, something stopped me, as if that being was telling me, you can't leave anymore. Now you have to stay. The gravedigger knew. There was no escape now. Whatever was there with him, he had to face it. He was about to discover. What happens when a cemetery reveals its deepest secrets? But what about you? If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you do whatever it takes to face the unknown? Or would you hide, try and forget what you saw? The darkness moved closer, and the gravedigger finally understood. Something ancient and powerful was about to be revealed. And now, there was no way out. He had gone too far. The gravedigger was out of strength, his hands sweating, his entire body trembling. The shadow before him seemed to grow even larger, taking shape in the darkness. He tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't respond. It was as if an invisible force had trapped him in place, pushing him forward into the unknown. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was pulsing, as if it were alive, reacting to his presence. Have you ever felt like you're about to lose control? As if, no matter how much you fight it, there's no way out. As if your own will has dissolved, and all that remains is darkness. The voice echoed again, closer now, whispering directly into his ears. There was no escape. No matter how much he tried to scream, his voice was being smothered by the earth itself, as if the entire cemetery was trying to consume him. I knew that what was happening there had no explanation, and no matter how much my mind tried to deny it, my body already knew it was too late. Something was happening, something beyond my comprehension. He looked again at the shadow. It was moving closer, but as it moved, it seemed as if the very darkness was spreading, taking over the space around him. He couldn't tell where the shadow began or where it ended. It was as if it was part of the cemetery itself, an extension of something much greater, something terrible. Have you ever seen something so incomprehensible, so beyond your understanding, that all you wanted to do was run, but your feet wouldn't move, as if a greater force was telling you to stay, to witness what was coming? The feeling of being watched was almost tangible. The gravedigger turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The cemetery was empty, yet he could feel the eyes on his back, a presence he couldn't see, but knew was there. Do you think you could still feel safe in a place like this, where every step you take is followed by something invisible, where the fear doesn't come from the unknown? The voice whispered again, clearer, louder. Now! It wasn't coming from all directions. It was coming from beneath him, from within the ground, as if the cemetery, the tombstones, and the dead themselves were trying to speak to him. The voice was cold, distant, but filled with an authority that made his entire body freeze. You saw me. Now, you can never leave. The gravedigger shut his eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to move away, but something stopped him. He was paralyzed, as if he had been marked, as if the earth itself had taken hold of him. He could feel his energy being drained, like he was being pulled into the ground, into the depths of the cemetery. Have you ever imagined what would happen if you were marked by the cemetery? If, somehow, the earth claimed you, asterisk, making you part of what's buried there? What would you do if you knew that by trying to escape, asterisk, you were already becoming part of it? He looked at the ground and saw that the earth was moving. It wasn't just the shadows. The earth itself was trembling, as if something was about to emerge. Fear consumed him. He didn't know if any of this was real, or if his mind was starting to collapse. But when he looked at the tombstones, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The names of the deceased were shifting right before his eyes. the letters rearranging themselves in unnatural ways. Have you ever felt like the dead were trying to communicate with you, as if the names on the tombstones, the words carved into the stone, weren't just a tribute, but a message? What would you do if you saw that the dead had something to say, something that couldn't be ignored? The gravedigger didn't know what to do. Time felt like it was stretching, each second pulling him closer to something he couldn't control. But he couldn't stop. Something inside him forced him to go deeper into the darkness. He knew he couldn't leave, not without finding out what was happening. The presence, the voice, the shadows, everything was leading him toward a terrible revelation, but one that had to be seen. Now, I wonder, what about you? What would you do if you knew that by looking deeper, you would discover something that would change the way you see life? Death. The shadow was now just a few steps away. For a moment, he felt like he was about to be consumed by the darkness. He took a deep breath, knowing that what happened next would change everything. The cemetery was finally ready to reveal its secret. But what about you? Do you have the courage to see what lies beyond death? Or will you close your eyes? Asterisk pretending that nothing ever happened. The gravedigger felt the darkness closing in around him, as if the cemetery itself was swallowing every last shred of light. His breathing was fast, but at the same time, a strange calm washed over him, as if somehow he already knew that what was about to happen could not be stopped. He looked at the tombstones around him, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The words on the stones seemed distorted, as if they were trying to form a message, something he couldn't quite understand. He slowly kneeled, pressing his hand against the cold earth. The sensation that something was moving beneath the surface was impossible to ignore. The ground seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was waiting for something, or someone, to come closer. He knew he was about to uncover something buried there, something so terrible that, once revealed, there would be no turning back. The shadow was closer now, almost within reach. He could feel the cold air radiating from it, a presence that wrapped around him, spreading throughout the entire cemetery. He couldn't turn away anymore. He was trapped there, at the heart of the cemetery, surrounded by a darkness that was more than just the absence of light. Each movement, each second, seemed to be devoured by that abyss. Then the voice whispered again, closer now. This time, it came from the ground itself. The cemetery was trying to speak. The earth, the tombstones, the dead, they had something to say. He looked at the engraved names, and right before his eyes, they were changing, each name twisted, shifting into words he didn't recognize. The ground beneath him began to tremble, not like a normal earthquake. No, it was something deeper, like the cemetery was preparing for something big, something that was waking beneath the earth. The gravedigger felt panic creeping in, but something inside him kept him from running. He was trapped, not by chains, but by an unseen force, pulling him deeper into the unknown. The shadow was no longer just a shapeless mass. It was taking form, not human, but something else, something as old as the cemetery itself. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, like lanterns illuminating nightmares. The gravedigger was about to face something that could not be explained, something so deep and terrifying that, by looking at it, his entire perception of life and death would crumble. He tried to back away, but something held him still. Not a physical force, but a pressure so intense that his body refused to move. There was no escape. The presence was everywhere, growing stronger, and he knew there was no way out. The wind picked up, shaking the trees, but the cemetery remained motionless, silent. The earth trembled beneath his feet, and he knew something was about to be revealed, something buried here for ages, something waiting for the right moment to rise again. The figure before him stepped closer, and the darkness swallowed everything. He couldn't tell anymore if what he was seeing was real, or if his mind was unraveling. But as he stared into that presence, he knew the truth was within reach, the truth he had been searching for. But now he felt it. It was far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The shadow extended a hand, not in a physical gesture, but as a force, like it was pulling him inside the darkness itself. He felt the weight on his chest. The figure moved closer, filling the void with a low, almost inaudible sound. Yet somehow it was loud enough to tear through the silence. The gravedigger couldn't breathe. Fear and curiosity twisted inside him, but his need to understand drove him forward. He knew if he took the next step, his life would never be the same again. The gravedigger stood frozen, the darkness engulfing him completely. The shadow before him, now fully formed, was closer than ever. Its eyes burned brightly, as if it had absorbed all the light around it. He felt the weight of its presence, crushing him. The air turned ice cold, and the sensation of being consumed by the earth made him feel like he was about to faint. I can't keep going, he thought, but his words were swallowed by the very darkness. The figure moved, a gesture, but one that could not be defined. It was as if time itself had stopped. The gravedigger tried to look away, tried to run, but he couldn't. His feet were rooted to the ground, as if the earth had come alive, holding him there, forcing him to face what stood before him. Then everything fell silent. A chill ran down his spine, but there was no sound, no movement. He looked around, and suddenly the darkness had vanished, as if something had been removed. The cemetery was empty, silent. He was back, at the center of the graveyard, but everything felt different. The tombstones were untouched. The inscriptions were clear, as if the chaos had never existed. The presence, the shadow, was gone. The gravedigger stood up slowly, his body still trembling. What just happened? What did I see? He tried to make sense of it, but his mind couldn't grasp what he had just experienced. He had been there, but nothing felt real. There were no signs that the cemetery had come alive. But then, something strange. As he looked down, he saw an inscription in the dirt, not on a headstone, but etched into the cold earth, something that had been written long ago. He stepped closer, his chest tightened, his pulse raced, and as he read the words, a mix of fear and confusion filled him. You were never here. Not now. Not anymore. He stumbled backward. His heart pounded wildly. He looked up at the cemetery, at the gravestones, at the quiet, empty space that now seemed harmless, yet completely different from what he had lived just moments ago. He couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. The feeling that something was still watching him clung to him like he had never truly left. The last thing he heard was the wind, soft but carrying a distant sound, a whisper, a word, a name, but it wasn't clear enough to understand. He turned back one last time, and the cemetery was empty, silent, but he knew no matter what happened next, he would never be the same. Something inside him had changed, something unexplainable. The screen fades to black. The gravedigger, still feeling the presence behind him, begins walking away from the cemetery. He disappears into the mist, and the question lingers in the air. Was he ever truly there at all?